My name is Chris Stroud. I'm an emeritus professor at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. And I'm going to speak very briefly to you about the notion of linguistic citizenship. So the notion of linguistic citizenship was coined at the turn of the millennium, 1999-2000, in Southern Africa, to draw attention to grassroots engagements with language, specifically multilingualism, as a dynamic of transformation. And since then, a number of us have been working with developing the concept. At the University of the Western Cape, colleagues such as Quentin Williams and Zadie Bock, and a cohort of enthusiastic students. At Stockholm University, where I'm also affiliated, Caroline Kerfoot. At the University of South Australia, Kathleen Huck, and at King's College London, researchers, sociolinguists such as Ben Rampton and Melanie Cook. Now, at the time we started formulating the idea of linguistic citizenship, issues of language and multilingualism were approached predominantly from the standpoint of a politics of recognition and within the affirmative framework of linguistic human rights. We argued that linguistic human rights, contrary to the intentions of its proponents, maintained and reproduced linguistic and social inequalities. Linguistic citizenship sought to provide, therefore, a framework for critically interrogating the historical and the socio-political and the economic determinants of how languages are constructed, how they are ideologized and practiced, at the same time as pinpointing the linguistic, structural and institutional conditions that are necessary in order to pursue change. So linguistic citizenship in this respect, looking at both representation, ideologization, and the material conditions around language and self and constituency community, it emphasizes bivalency of language. And this is the philosopher Nancy Fraser's term. She refers to it as meaning neither socioeconomic maldistribution or cultural misrecognition are an indirect effect of the other, but both are primary and co-original. So this suggests that language, refiguration of language, rethinking language is needed, and that it must go hand in hand with social, political, and economic transformation. Bivalency allows us to see language and citizenship as two sides of the same coin. Citizenship as mediated by forms of language, while forms of language emerge in turn out of and with the fluid, the tense, and the shifting entanglements of social and material engagement. Importantly, I think linguistic citizenship is about politics, in the sense that Rancière refers to it, contrasting it with policing, where policing is managing the everyday, the status quo, incorporating more people, for example, through linguistic human rights into existing non-transformed or non-transformational structures and systems. Politics, as opposed to policing then, is that which allows what was seen previously as what Rancière calls phonos, noise, rabble-rousing, to become logos, voice. Thus, the sense of citizenship in linguistic citizenship goes beyond the institutional and regulated forms of engagement in conventional understandings of nation-state citizenships to other forms of relationality in order to re-establish humanity in a society of plural others as co-conversationalists and as interlocutors. Acts of linguistic citizenship build collectivities and new relationalities in the interstices, the margins, the cracks, the fissures, the flows that make up the rhizomatic underbellies of societal structures and institutions. And these are institutions predominantly premised on exclusion. Likewise, the diverse and complex configurations of citizenship outside of the conventional understanding of politics and its institutions invite a critical stance towards notions of language that occlude a diversity of other voices as noise. In the process of engaging politically in the Rawlsian sense, speakers reconfigure language through the creations of new meanings, repurpose genres, and transform repertoires in using their language over many modalities. These are often transgressive and non-conventional language, other forms of semiosis, such as, for example, tattoos. They open up possibilities for thought and action beyond the constraints of established genres of power. Linguistic citizenship is thus an invitation to listen beyond and within that which is conventionally classified as noise, and attending to those forms of language through which also speakers who do not count, who find themselves on the margin of society, the wrong side of the abyssal line, find voice and gain agency, thus broadening what we take to be language. In this way, it encourages disciplinary disobedience, so as to clear the ground for a reconceptualization and expansion of legitimate modalities for voice, thereby doing violence to language and linguistics. In other words, the conjunction of linguistic with citizenship unsettles both our conventional understandings of language as well as of citizenship. In all of these respects, acts of citizenship, linguistic citizenship, frames a decolonial ethos that articulates well with that of, for example, Frantz Fanon. Fanon writes passionately on the plight of the dispossessed, the marginalized, and the excluded, the damned of the earth, who inhabit the zone of non-being. He seeks revolutionary transformation in new socialities and the creation of a new man. This requires seeking revolutionary transformation of inequitable material, economic, and political capital, and going beyond the strictures of normative language, long appropriated to structural whiteness, for example, in an idea of language misrecognized as signification without body. So linguistic citizenship, not surprisingly, shares with Fanon the understanding that selves are essentially dependent on the affirmation of ethical self-other relationships, and that such reciprocal recognition by a plurality of others is a prerequisite for voice and agency and a prerequisite for freedom. Reciprocal recognition is what allows speakers to become interlocutors and to engage in the building of ethical constituencies of others. Linguistic citizenship recognizes that language, as we know it, produces vulnerabilities and marginalizes speakers, and that in order to be heard and to count, new forms of language are a precondition for, as well as an outcome of, new socialities. As Gabriela Veronelli, the Argentinian philosopher, emphasizes, there is a need for new registers of emotionality to capture meanings and selves that are otherwise distorted by conventional linguistic expression, formed through decades, centuries of white dominance. Acts of linguistic citizenship refer to those linguistic, more broadly semiotic gestures that build communities and pluralities of mutually and reciprocally recognized others. And this, I think, is one of the more important points, as opposed to an approach of linguistic human rights that seeks to build constituencies of like selves, be these racial, ethnic, or whatever. Linguistic citizenship requires or works towards a society of others. So these are the means whereby interlocutors are created and semiotic space is crafted where absences emerge as presences. And of course, it goes without saying perhaps that linguistic citizenship goes beyond practices of emerging genres of conventional language, or the repurposing or rupturing of established genres and new functions. It also involves the invention of new modalities of expression. Transgressive, non-conventional language, forms of semiosis that open up possibilities for thought and action beyond these established constraints of power. And these may be unconventional genres such as multimodal performances, use of material artifacts that lay bare the synergies of body, affect, and language in the pursuit of voice and ontological refashioning. So linguistic citizenship in a Fanonian framing, finally, would quite simply comprise a community of others in reciprocal recognition, in vulnerable engagement, and in loving transformation. A community not of sameness and not of diversity, but of differences. To engage in acts of linguistic citizenship is to engage in jointly orchestrated becomings, in pursuit of non-determinate futures, as openness to a plurality of others will inevitably gestate ripples of continuous change. Thus, linguistic citizenship is very much about a politics of surprise and a politics of the unpredictable that the philosopher Grosch writes about. Thank you.